History as it happens, May 9th, 2023. Section 4.
It's essential that the debt ceiling be raised in a timely way.
The House Republicans just passed the only bill in Washington that lifts the debt limit, ends wasteful Washington spending.
This is a hard right-wing wish list that everyone knows has no chance of passing.
I thank the Republicans for the clarity with which they have put forth their Default on America Act.
Can the 14th Amendment save us from defaulting on our debts if Congress can't agree to raise the debt limit? Well, I don't want to say that depends on who you ask, but like so much of the Constitution, Section 4 of the 14th Amendment means different things to different people today as it did in the 1860s. Wait, you've never read Section 4? Time for some civics, among other subjects, with Jeremi Suri next, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
How do you understand the functioning of our society? You study how our society was formed from the founding forward, and you study how it has functioned and changed over time. And one of the important lessons of civics is that a democracy is ever evolving. The rules are ever changing for the time. That's what keeps democracy active, and that's what allows democracy to work.
In 1866, the U.S. House and Senate, by wide margins, overrode President Andrew Johnson's veto to pass the first Civil Rights Act in the country's history. If you read Johnson's veto message, you'll see he did not hide his white supremacy. But now, for the first time, Congress would be explicitly empowered to stop state governments from enforcing racist laws. Both chambers were dominated by Republicans. The southern states that had seceded did not participate in the 1864 elections, so that explains why there were so few Democrats in Congress who might have voted against the bill. But as historian Kate Mazur explains in her superb book, Until Justice Be Done, congressional Republicans didn't stop with the Civil Rights Act of 1866. They continued their work on the 14th Amendment to make federal protection for basic rights more secure. Basic rights. If you read the original Constitution as a liberty document, as I do, despite its unfortunate concessions to slavery, then you might argue it was meant to protect our liberties. But what that actually meant was fought over from day one of George Washington's presidency, even before that actually, up to the outbreak of Civil War and beyond. So after the Civil War ended, congressional Republicans wanted to fix, as Mazur puts it, the Constitution's central problem that it did not directly authorize Congress to enforce the Privileges and Immunities Clause or the rights enumerated in the Fifth Amendment. So, Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, reads, "All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." Section 2 says states that deny their citizens the right to vote would lose representation in Congress. Section 3 bars anyone who violates their oath by taking part in insurrection from seeking office ever again. But it is Section 4 that's making a comeback of sorts today, as House Republicans, not to be confused with the 19th century Republicans of the party of Lincoln, threatened to take Congress over the fiscal cliff. Speaker Kevin McCarthy says they will not agree to raise the debt ceiling unless the Biden administration agrees to major spending cuts first.
The sad part here is now the Democrats need to do their job. The president can no longer ignore by not negotiating. Senator Schumer, if he thinks he's got a plan, put it on the floor. See if you can pass it, and then we can go to conference. But now, the president can no longer put this economy in jeopardy.
Congress and the White House have until about June 1st to agree on something, or the U.S. could begin defaulting on its obligations. And that, in the words of Senate Majority Leader Charles Schumer, would be a disaster.
Democrats want to avoid defaulting on our country's debts. Meanwhile, Speaker McCarthy continues to bumble our country towards a catastrophic default.
Today's debate is very partisan, but it's worth remembering that back in 2019, then-President Trump agreed. He and congressional Democrats raised the debt ceiling multiple times without using it as a bargaining tool.
I can't imagine anybody ever even thinking of using the debt ceiling as a negotiating wedge. When I first came into office, I asked about the debt ceiling, and I understand debt ceilings, and I certainly understand a the highest rated credit ever in history, and a debt ceiling. And I said, I remember to Senator Schumer and to Nancy Pelosi, would anybody ever use that to negotiate with? They said, absolutely not. That's a sacred element of our country. They can't use the debt ceiling to negotiate.
So what does Section 4 of the 14th Amendment, which was designed to protect public debt held by the federal government and prohibit payment of debt held by the Confederate States, have to say about this current day situation? The validity of the public debt of the United States, says Section 4, authorized by law, including debts incurred for payment of pensions and bounties for services in suppressing insurrection or rebellion, shall not be questioned. Now, some legal scholars today contend this wording gives the executive branch the authority to continue issuing new debt if Congress fails to do its job. Now, no president's ever taken this authority, of course. No president's been in a position to try, even if he wanted to. Back in 2011, when President Obama faced the same problem, his spokesman Jay Carney told CNN they would not invoke the 14th Amendment if House Republicans forced the U.S. government into default, although at the time, former President Clinton had called on Obama to do just that and then let the court sort it out.
No, we have made clear, the president addressed this last Friday in a press conference, that we have looked into what the 14th Amendment does and doesn't say, and it clearly establishes that Congress and Congress alone has the authority to increase the debt ceiling to further our borrowing authority.
One can imagine such a case would make it all the way to the Supreme Court, and what a civics lesson that would be. We're not going to wait for that eventuality. We're going to talk about it right now. The 14th Amendment is arguably the most consequential amendment ever ratified after the Bill of Rights. It was passed in a certain historical context in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, but its words stand for all time. It made a more perfect union, as the Supreme Court itself said in an important 1869 ruling. Jeremi Suri is a historian at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, and his most recent book is Civil War by Other Means, America's Long and Unfinished Fight for Democracy. I read Jeremi's book last year and interviewed him about it on the podcast. You can find that episode. Its title is The War That Never Ended. And I also recommend the Kate Mazur book I mentioned earlier, Until Justice Be Done. Jeremi Suri, welcome back, my friend.
Good to be with you, Martin.
Should I get the Jets gloating out of the way? Or maybe I shouldn't even be gloating about this. I mean, Aaron Rodgers is 40 years old. You had him for, 18 years in Green Bay?
That's right. That's right. And if you watched him play last year, he's not throwing the ball quite as well. So we'll see. I mean, you've got a good team. You'll win a few games, and you'll probably lose a lot of games.
Hey, don't jinx us. How did you, University of Texas at Austin history professor, become a Green Bay Packers fan?
So before we moved down to Austin, the first 10 years of my career from 2001 to 2011, I was on the faculty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and we loved it. We could have stayed there forever. We loved it. We were drawn to Austin. We were recruited down to Austin, but when we left Madison, I refused to leave the Packers behind.
It's great. University of Wisconsin at Madison. That is one of the great institutions in our country.
It is. And Madison's a great city, just as Austin is. We've been very fortunate to live in two great places.
Well, I was just in Charlottesville, another great college town.
Absolutely.
So did you teach a lot of civics at University of Wisconsin? Because we're going to talk civics today.
You know, I always teach a lot of civics because to me, history is civics and civics is history. How do you understand the functioning of our society? You study how our society was formed from the founding forward, and you study how it has functioned and changed over time. And one of the important lessons of civics is that a democracy is ever evolving. The rules are ever changing for the time. That's what keeps democracy active, and that's what allows democracy to work. My history courses, especially my basic U.S. history courses, they are civics courses, Martin.
And I thought of civics when I wanted to do this episode with you. The 14th Amendment and the debt ceiling? How is there a connection there? You know, there's so much talk, so much debate right now, Jeremi, about the bonds of our republic. Why are they fraying? Why are we so divided? Why can't we agree on even whether the sky is blue or the grass is green? It reminds me of a piece in The Atlantic from a couple of years ago, Can Civics Save America by George Packer. He's talking about maybe if we have a common understanding of what the Constitution actually says, what our laws actually say and mean, maybe there won't be unity, but maybe our arguments will all be reality-based. I'm not sure. I mean, what are your thoughts generally on that issue?
Well, George's point runs in some ways, and I'm a big fan of George Packer's work, but it runs in some ways against my recent book, Civil War by Other Means, because the point I make there is we've never really had a common understanding of what the Constitution means. There always have been debates. The Civil War is just the most extreme version of that. But as I show in my book, and as other historians have shown, in the 100 years after the Civil War, there is deep disagreement over, for example, what the 14th Amendment means. What does that phrase, equal protection under the laws, mean? We have never, since that amendment was ratified in 1868, we've never had a common consensus. For some, that has meant a multiracial society. For some, that has meant the right not to be imposed upon in ways that one doesn't want to embrace diversity. It has meant different things to different people. And when you get down to brass tacks, it's meant different things in how you set up schools, in how you set up local government. What keeps our society vibrant are the debates, Martin. What holds us together are some common rules. And so I'm less concerned about trying to create an imagined world where Americans all agree on what the 14th Amendment means. I'm more interested in having basic rules that govern the way we have those debates. And the 14th Amendment sets out some rules. We can disagree on what equal protection means, and equal protection will change over time. Many of us now believe equal protection involves access, equal access for those of trans and other sexual orientations. That's not how people thought 50 years ago, right? So our understanding of equal protection will always change. That said, we have to have rules, for example, that those who have led insurrection don't get to be in office. And that's what the 14th Amendment says.
Section 3. We'll get into some of these individual sections because I get excited when I am forced to, in preparation for my podcast, go back and read parts of the Constitution, read amendments. I was watching Jeopardy a couple of weeks ago, and one of the clues was about the Bill of Rights. I paused the show, and I tried to go over in my head, can I name the first 10 amendments to the Constitution? I came close. I think it's healthy for all Americans to revisit these documents and actually read them. But to your point, we can't even agree on what equal protection means. But some of this is intractable. Point number one, we have a mixed system here. We do have a central government, but we have a federalist system, right? And also, the original Constitution was written vaguely, and every attempt to try to clarify that language with something as explicit as the 14th Amendment, well, just creates a new host of disputes.
That's absolutely right. And the debates are good things to have. What keeps our civics vibrant is when we are debating these things. The problem we have today is not just that we're divided. We've often been divided, again, as I've shown and others have shown in their writings. It's that we're oftentimes ignorant and we're not actually discussing these issues. I would like us to have more of an explicit debate about what we mean by equal protection, and I'm okay if there's disagreement. That would be a worthwhile civics debate, and we could have elections where people vote based on that. That would be fine.
Yeah, I think that's why there is a new emphasis, at least in some quarters, a call for a greater emphasis on civics education, because how many folks, and I agree with you, there is ignorance here. And I don't say that because I'm any genius. I'm not a historian. But I think as informed citizens, we have a responsibility to at least know what's going on here. So an argument about whether Congress should now raise the debt ceiling or cut spending first in exchange for an agreement on raising the debt ceiling, wherever you come down on that debate, that it can at least be grounded in reality and not just a hyper-partisan, my side is right, your side is wrong.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's a core issue here that really isn't the issue of spending, though that's a very fair debate to have when we debate budgets. This is the issue. Does the executive, or should the executive, have the authority to pay our bills that have been authorized by Congress? Let's just be clear on where we are. And this is not the first time. It's not the 5th time. It's the 100th time we've been in this place. Sometimes it's a big controversy. Sometimes it's not. But here's the issue, right? Congress passes a budget which authorizes the executive and other parts of our government to spend money. It takes on, therefore, obligations. When there isn't enough money in the government bank account, the government borrows money in the same way that you might use your credit card if you don't have cash in your pocket when you go to, I don't know if anyone carries cash in their pocket, when you go to buy a sandwich. And so the question is, who has the authority to raise debt to cover congressionally authorized liabilities by the U.S. government?
So, Section 4 reads, the validity of the public debt of the United States authorized by law, including debts incurred for payment of pensions and bounties for services in suppressing insurrection or rebellion, shall not be questioned. So the validity of the public debt of the United States shall not be questioned. Questioned is a weird kind of word to put in there. Let's talk about the origins of this section of the amendment. 1868 is when it's finally ratified, passed by Congress in 1866. Where did this come from?
So this amendment came out of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which Congress passed, and President Andrew Johnson, who had replaced President Lincoln when Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson vetoed the Civil Rights Bill. Congress overrode his veto because the Republicans dominated both houses, of course. So it became the law of the land, but there was concern that the executive still would not enforce it, and Johnson made it clear he wouldn't enforce the law. Johnson did not want to use federal power to enforce access to education, access to land, access to business for former slaves. So Congress not only passed legislation, they then moved forward to make it an amendment. They wanted this to be so firmly entrenched in our society that there were basic rights for formerly enslaved people. Now, that section in particular of the amendment, Section 4, is designed to prevent Democrats, to prevent the party of the Confederacy from refusing to pay the debts that would be incurred by the Union, in particular, the debts to fund Reconstruction and the debts to enforce the law. Here's the fear the Republicans had. As Democrats came back into Congress, they would defund the efforts at Reconstruction, defund the efforts at civil rights. And the way you would do that is by refusing to pay the bills. So that's why the word questioned is in there, which, as far as I know, it's the only place it appears in the Constitution. I don't think that phrasing is used anywhere else. And what they're saying is you can't even bring that up. That cannot be considered by Congress. They're taking that off the plate. Congress does not have the right to defund the enforcement of the law in the South. Now, as we know, Congress does find ways to limit spending on that later on, but not to limit the spending, the incurred liabilities for Reconstruction.
Yeah, as you said, as Democrats from the South started to return to Congress as their states start to rejoin the Union, there was a concern that they would ignore the federal debt or the Union's debt, right, and instead do something with the Confederate debt.
Correct. That's the second part of that amendment that you didn't read, but it basically says after the section you read that any debts incurred by the Confederacy, and that would also apply to legacies of the Confederacy, right? That it's null and void. It has no legal legitimate standing. So basically, regardless of what Congress does, Congress must pay the debt of the Union in fighting the Civil War and in Reconstruction, and Congress will not pay, the government will not pay the debt of the Confederacy. Confederate money becomes worthless as a consequence.
So those circumstances no longer obtain today, but the Biden administration is arguing that they can still pay the government's bills even if Congress doesn't agree to raise the debt ceiling. Right?
They're not necessarily making that argument. There are members of the Biden administration saying he has that authority.
Okay.
So what we've done...
But what's the difference there then?
Generally, especially in the 20th century, and we've used different mechanisms, but when the government needs to take on debt, and it did not take on much debt in the 19th century, it takes on a lot in the 20th century, particularly after World War II, we've generally had Congress pass authorization for the president to increase his credit card limit, to increase the spending to cover, not things that the president decided to do, but to cover expenses that Congress authorized in the budget. Any budget bill has to go through Congress, has to start in the House of Representatives. The congressional authorization for the president to raise the debt, presidents have relied upon because they want congressional consent. There's never been a ruling in any court that says the president has to do that. He has to get permission to raise his credit card limit, so long as what he's spending money on is in a budget that's been authorized already by Congress.
And we're only one of maybe 2 or 3 countries in the world that has this issue, this problem.
Correct.
It only becomes a real problem when you have some folks in Congress saying they will risk a default unless they get cuts to programs, etc.
More often than not, not always, more often than not, Congress has just raised the debt limit to cover the authorized spending in the budget.
Long before it becomes a crisis.
Correct. This was done, I believe, 3 or 4 times during Trump's presidency, and Democrats voted for this. Why does one do this? Because Congress has authorized the spending. Let's be clear. Congress has authorized spending for Social Security checks. And so what the debt ceiling does is allow the president to borrow the money to pay out Social Security checks when there's not enough money in the government's account. The question here is not what we've done in past practice. In past practice, Congress has authorized the debt ceiling to go up. But the question is whether the president really needs to do that or whether he already, because of this language, has that authority.
So what does Supreme Court Justice Jeremi Suri think then? I am really not, I don't have the legal background, even though I did some preparation for this conversation. So in the end, how might the 14th Amendment be applied here?
I think the 14th Amendment was written originally as the Civil Rights Act of 1866 to prevent one party from stopping the functioning of government. And that is what it seems to me that one party wants to do here. We went through this during Clinton's presidency as well. And in the future, it could be the other way around. It could be the Democrats trying to stop the Republicans. But I think the 14th Amendment's language and intentions, historically, I'm a historian, is that one party should not be able to stop the government from undertaking its basic tasks of providing security and equal protection under the law, first clause of the 14th Amendment, because they refuse to pay the debt.
Yeah.
That
shall never be questioned.
Never be questioned, right? Yeah. Those debates about how much to spend are totally legitimate debates, but those are budget debates. And every year there has to be a budget passed, and that's the time to argue over spending. You shouldn't be able to hold a gun to the president's head and say, okay, now that we've authorized the spending, we're not going to let you spend the money we've authorized until you agree to something else for us. And that was the intention of this amendment, to prevent the Democrats from holding a gun to the head of the Republicans to stop them from enforcing civil rights.
Eric Foner, the great historian of this period, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about the debt ceiling a couple months ago. I'll just share a few sentences from this for the benefit of our listeners. He said, as you did, Jeremy, the section arose from political conflicts over the way the Civil War had been financed. To pay the war's enormous cost, Congress printed legal tender paper money, the greenbacks, raised taxes to unprecedented heights, and authorized the sale of hundreds of millions of dollars in interest-bearing bonds. Nearly all the laws, Foner writes, authorizing the issuance of bonds specified the government would redeem the notes in gold. The one exception was the act related to the 520s, bonds redeemable in 5 years and payable in 20, which was silent on how those who had lent money to the government by purchasing these bonds would be repaid. And Foner then quotes historian Erwin Unger about this oversight, led directly to a decade of intense and exasperating conflict.
The government functions by issuing, to make it very simple, treasury bills that people buy. When someone buys a treasury bill or a mutual fund buys a treasury bill, they're investing in the government. The debt is the paying back of that. So there are treasury bills that come due that have to be paid back, and the government has to float new treasury bills to keep going. That's how revolving credit works.
So as Foner argues here, Section 4 was the Republicans' response to these conflicts. To our modern eyes, we might look at the original Constitution as being a liberty document, right? It's supposed to codify, if you will, the guiding principle of our new nation. Fundamental equality, equal protection under the law. Article 4, Section 2, the Privileges and Immunities Clause. But it was never clear what it meant to be a citizen and what privileges and immunities you would have, depending on which state you were in. Were you a citizen of a state, or were you a citizen of the United States? And you start to look back at this, and you're like, well, Jefferson Davis, certainly, we know where he stood on all of this. Right. Do I want to take his side in these battles? 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were necessary in the end.
And really the most important part of the 14th Amendment, and I think...
And Jeremy, I'll just interject here. I do not take Jefferson Davis's side when it comes to interpreting the original Constitution, but go ahead. Yeah.
Right. But the Constitution, as you say, was vague, and that's because the founders didn't have any agreement on this. The 14th Amendment, Section 1, very clearly, this is now where we get back to the area of setting basic rules, very clearly says that anyone born in the United States is a citizen of the federal government and a citizen of the state where they are born and reside. That's as clear as day. That means that it doesn't matter. This is what's so radical about that at its time, right? It means it settles this issue. Whether you're black, white, brown, it doesn't matter. You're born in the United States, you're a citizen. Very few countries actually have natural-born citizenship. We have natural-born citizenship. And so what that does is it makes it impossible for someone to say that someone, because they were born into slavery or because they look a certain way, that they don't have the same citizenship standing as anyone else.
And these amendments didn't end the story either, because the Supreme Court in later rulings basically nullified these amendments. And we know that southern states used loopholes in the 15th Amendment to disenfranchise African Americans until the 1960s, when we needed another slate of laws.
But unlike Dred Scott in 1857, the Supreme Court could never again say that a black person was not a citizen.
That's right. The Dred Scott ruling was the worst ruling in American history.
But this is important, right? Yeah. Because it means that you could not deny their citizenship. Now, what their citizenship meant, that's what you're talking about, right? And so Plessy versus Ferguson says you're not entitled to go to the same schools, but you're still citizens, even in separate schools.
Well, what kind of citizenship is that then? I mean, that's what it comes down to. What kind of country do we want to have?
I agree with that. I agree with that. But it means you cannot tell people who were formerly slaves they have to leave the country, the way we do tell immigrants sometimes and refugees sometimes.
Kate Mazur drills down to it on page 332 of Until Justice Be Done about the 14th Amendment, how it leads with Congress shall have power. This was meant to remedy the Constitution, the original Constitution's central problem, that it did not directly authorize Congress to enforce the Privileges and Immunities Clause or the rights enumerated in the Fifth Amendment. So I was talking about Jeopardy before, about how I was trying to, from memory, name all 10 of the amendments in the Bill of Rights. And the Fifth Amendment, due process, refers to persons, not citizens. But for a long time, people interpreted that as it only constrained the federal government, not the states. I think that's something that people overlook, our emphasis on civics here, that the Bill of Rights for a while didn't apply to state governments.
The point of that argument was that the Constitution was designed to empower federal government and the Bill of Rights was designed to limit and restrict the federal government. That's the argument that was there. But the 14th Amendment, as Kate Mazur has written so well, in many ways settles that issue because of that fifth clause, which gives Congress the power to enforce this legislation. And it's clear it's talking about Congress enforcing this legislation throughout the country. It doesn't say Congress can only enforce this legislation in Washington, D.C., right? The actual clause of the 14th Amendment, Clause 5, says, it's the simplest of all the clauses, Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. So Congress can enforce equal protection under the law is what it's saying.
And prior to the Civil War, of course, there were conflicts about this. I mean, they often would get to federal court, and folks who took the more expansive view of personal freedom often lost. I mean, there was a question of whether a federal court could even handle these cases.
Correct. Correct. And so this changes our jurisprudence. And this gets us back to the beginning where we started, right? We should have a debate over what citizenship means. Does citizenship mean I have the right to health care, right? I mean, these are important debates. Does it mean I have the right to an education? And we can have legitimate debates on that. You and I might actually be debating that. But we cannot deny that everyone born in this country is a citizen. We cannot deny that Congress has the right to enforce basic rules of equal protection. And we cannot deny that the president has some power to raise money to cover the budget that's been authorized by Congress.
Because we're a union, not a voluntary confederacy of states. The states are within a country, the United States.
Well, this is Lincoln's point.
Yes.
And I know both of us revere Lincoln, right? This is the whole point of the Cooper Union Address. The states don't exist without the Union. Maybe Texas can claim it had independent existence. Right. Maybe Vermont, maybe Alaska, maybe Hawaii. But none of them, and none of the other states had independent existence. There is no New York State before there is a union.
We're still having this debate today, aren't we? I mean, look at the pandemic, right? I mean, this doesn't involve the 14th Amendment, what we're talking here. Some people viewed freedom as, I have a right and I have the freedom to do whatever I want. You can't force me to put on a mask. Others would say, well, don't you feel like you have an obligation to your fellow citizens not to spread a potentially deadly disease? I mean, that whole debate.
To some extent, those are debates we have to have.
Yeah.
That's fair game. And why does civics matter? Not because civics tells us what your answer should be. There's no answer on masks in the Constitution or in any amendment, but it does tell us what the rules of legitimate debate are. You cannot say that because you're a citizen of the United States, the federal government can never tell you what to do. That's wrong. Obviously, right? Everyone listening files a tax return. We have a personal income tax. That's also a constitutional amendment. The government does have some authority, but the government doesn't have the right to say that it willy-nilly gets to tell you what the health standards in your life should be. So there are certain rules. Within those rules, within that framework, we can have a debate, just as you were putting it forth. Is this the legitimate use of government power, or is it not the legitimate use of government power?
In your conclusion to your book, Jeremy, you argue that we need to update things. I mean, a constitutional amendment seems difficult. Well, in the past, these amendments seem difficult, and somehow they managed to get them done, right?
Yeah.
But you're saying our institutions are in some ways outdated. We can look at the 14th Amendment here, Section 3. No person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state who have previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer, etc., etc. Cut to the chase. If you have engaged in insurrection or rebellion. So this has now been brought up because of January 6th. Now, Donald Trump has not been charged. He's not been indicted. An indictment is not a conviction. I mean, I'm not a legal expert on this, but it seems unlikely he'll be convicted of insurrection or rebellion. The issue of Trump and the indictments, I brought this up recently with Michael Dobbs, who's a Watergate chronicler, about how, we really don't have any precedent in our country for this issue of prosecuting a current or former president, right? This is the very first time. And how Ford's pardon of Nixon may have robbed us of that precedent. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Finally, I feel that Richard Nixon and his loved ones have suffered enough and will continue to suffer no matter what I do, no matter what we, as a great and good nation, can do together to make his goal of peace come true.
Well, we didn't have a president who engaged in insurrection. So
that wasn't really a question either. It was more of a word salad, as I say, but go ahead.
We have used this, right? It was actually recently used, I think, in Arizona, right?
That's right, yes.
The courts ruled that I believe it was a county sheriff could not serve. I think that's right. Because of this, there have been incidents, but we have been fortunate, Martin, that in our history, unlike the history of most other societies, we've had very few individuals who took an oath of office who actually engaged in insurrection since the Civil War. You could call the Civil War an example of that. And in that case, those who were the members of the Senate and the House and others, they were pardoned. Jeff Davis was not convicted, but others were pardoned by Andrew Johnson.
That's right.
So
a multiracial jury actually was sat to deal with the case of Jefferson Davis, but it never went to trial.
That's exactly right. Yeah. This provision, this part of the 14th Amendment was never renounced, and I think that was intentional. It seems perfectly reasonable and in line with constitutional jurisprudence to say that your oath of office is actually legally actionable, which is to say that if you violate your oath by committing insurrection, we're not talking fibs and small lies. We're not even talking about a wealthy donor taking you on vacation and paying for your mother's house. Hey. That's questionable too. We're talking instead about someone leading an effort to undermine the government and the Constitution, which is the basis of the oath. And it's important, right? It's the only set of words in the Constitution we are required to mouth, to say, when going into one of these high offices, right? That you pledge to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. So that seems fair, but we could revisit these things. I think the biggest challenge we face today is not actually the civics challenge of not understanding our history. It's that, in fact, we are stuck with doing things in the way we've been doing them when it doesn't work because we can't agree on what to do next. Let's go back to the obvious bête noire. No one is really happy about the Electoral College. But yet, since we can't agree what to do instead of the Electoral College, we stick with it.
And it would be so divisive trying to fix it. The same arguments are used when it comes to Trump's legal cases, that the amount of division it will create in our country by prosecuting him. And I just want to correct something I said before. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment does not say you need to be convicted in a court of law of insurrection or rebellion. It says, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, meaning your office.
I think it's fair to say that language is saying it has to be a court of law that would do it. And that's how, as I understand it, that's when this has been challenged. That's what's happened. But I think this is a really important point, right? I mean, why do we need to have a debate about civics? Not because there's some secret formula in the Constitution that explains everything. No, it's because they're debates we need to have. So here's what civics would tell us about our democracy. We need to have a very serious debate about how our democracy gives power, allocates power and authority, especially electoral power. And we need to then go back to our civic values of representation, one person, one vote, and then ask, how can we adjust and reform our system so it's more in line with one person, one vote, which it's not right now.
Wow, yeah, there is really nothing straightforward about this. Except in the end, my view comes down to what kind of country do we want to have? Do we want to take a more expansive view of what equal protection means, right? Or do we want to take a more constricted view of that?
We should begin with that as a point of departure for our debates. And that's, again, what civics is. It's not secret formulas. It's understanding the basic values, basic rules, and then debating within those.
Yeah. Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution. The citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. Sounds straightforward, right? Yep. Right. It never was straightforward through all the conflict in the pre-Civil War.
And it isn't today.
Period. No, that's right. Yeah, we're still debating this. You can go to the Federalist Papers, where both Hamilton and Madison discussed what they thought that should mean. And of course, you'll have people today saying, the founders are 18th century dudes, pre-modern, pre-Darwin, pre-industrial society. Why do we need to pay attention to what they're saying? I think we still do in the proper context.
Yes, yes, I agree.
Well, Jeremi, I'm glad that you were here to help me through this thicket of law and political history, because I would have been lost without you.
Well, I'm so glad that you're covering this, and I'm so glad that you're encouraging people to think about these issues and to engage in, and here I'm going to use the Jeffersonian term, civic debate. That's what we need. There are good debates and bad debates. Good debates are debates within our frame of civics. Bad debates are ones where, as you said, it's just power for me or power for you. That's not a civics debate.
Indeed, Jeremi Suri. We thank you again for returning to the podcast, and his book is titled Civil War by Other Means. Now, here is my non-homework assignment. I'm not telling you to do this all at once, not telling you to do it at all, simply encouraging you, as these issues pop up in the news, to go back and read the documents. We can all use more civics. Read the 14th Amendment, return to the Constitution, read the Bill of Rights, understand how the federal budget works. It would help us all, myself included, to have a better grasp of the basics. On the next episode of History as It Happens, it was 60 years ago when the world was brought to the precipice of nuclear conflict.
Unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
And we'll be joined by scholars of Russian history with new insights into the Cuban Missile Crisis and how they apply to Russia's war in Ukraine. Next, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.